Open up any newspaper and it will testify to how violent our culture is. We need to be a people of peace, promoting peace and embodying the commandment against murder. Brad McKinnon is the Dean of Students at Heritage Christian University, and he preaches for the Plainview Church of Christ. In this lesson, he helps us think about the sixth commandment.
As we continue this Berean series on the Ten Commandments, we come to the sixth commandment. The traditional rendering is, "Thou shalt not kill." Most modern translations now have it, "You shall not murder." As we think about this commandment, we need to first think about it in its context. And so I invite you to look at Exodus 20. And the commandment is found in verse 13, "You shall not murder." But I think it's good for us to sort of step back for a second and look at a little bit of a broader context that sort of includes the Ten Commandments as a whole. And the first thing that I notice as I look at the Ten Commandments as a whole is I see that the responsibilities that are sort of inherent within the commands themselves sort of are first vertical. And by vertical, I mean our relationship with God. And second, horizontal. Or by that, we're thinking relationship with each other, those sort of interpersonal relationships we have with each other. And so you notice that as the commandments begin, it's about relationship with God. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not have other gods before me. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day, and so forth and so on. But then when we get to verse 12, the commandments take a more human, interpersonal sort of context. And it's natural for the first sort of horizontal, interpersonal one to be honor your father and your mother, because those are the first interpersonal relationships that we have. So as we're born and we begin to grow and develop relationships, our first relationships are with our mothers and our fathers. Hopefully those are good relationships. Hopefully those are safe spaces. And so it's very natural for us to think about how to relate to our parents in a way that, as the commandment describes, can be described as a relationship where there's honor or there's respect. But as we begin to mature and we begin to come of age, obviously then we begin to experience interpersonal relationships outside of that earliest dynamic. And so we see, for instance, in the early part of Genesis, you see the relationship between Adam and Eve and their children, and then the first archetypical murder happens just outside of that parental relationship when Cain murders his brother Abel. And so it's very natural then to see from honor your father and your mother, the lead in then is to sort of this baseline ethic we have in verse 13, you shall not murder. And so this is the very baseline of how we treat each other. That we are not to kill one another. And then, of course, from that baseline, you then have the other commandments that others will consider in this series. And so I think it's first important to recognize that in order to have a right relationship with each other, we need to first have a right relationship with God. And so we need to focus on the vertical aspects of our relationship with God first. Then second, we begin focusing on the interpersonal relationships, as we've mentioned, the horizontal relationships. And as we do that, we begin with sort of the earliest primal relationships, the parental relationships. And then as we grow and develop, and as we venture out into the world, we have other relationships, and the baseline for those relationships is you shall not murder. Now, as we think about this commandment, I think it's important to draw our attention to the Beatitudes as Jesus begins the Sermon on the Mount as we think about this sixth commandment in context. Matthew's Gospel is interesting because if you begin reading Matthew's Gospel, one of the things that you'll notice right at the beginning in the first several chapters is that Matthew seems to be trying to sort of describe Jesus as sort of the ultimate Israelite, or you might say the new Moses. So, for instance, Moses had to be hidden from an evil tyrant who was bent on murdering him. He had to be hidden from that tyrant, and the same is true of Jesus, that in his earliest days he had to be hidden from a ruler that was out to kill him. We continue thinking about those sort of connections. Jesus obviously spent time in Egypt, and so his parents took him and they escaped to Egypt. So he's taken into Egypt, he's brought out of Egypt. And certainly that connects us to the Exodus and Moses leading the children of Israel out of Egypt. And then, of course, Moses, as he leads Israel out of Egypt, what ends up happening is they end up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And of course, we remember just after Jesus' baptism, he is out in the wilderness and he spends 40 days and 40 nights out in the wilderness. And just like God took care of the Israelites, after that 40 days and nights in the wilderness, Jesus is taken care of by the angels. And so we see those sort of connections that an Israelite reader of Matthew's Gospel would recognize right away. But for us, it may be, we have to sort of dig into it a little bit. But once we notice it, we can't help but sort of make those connections. So when we come to Jesus' public ministry, the beginning of it, here in Matthew 5, it's not surprising that when Jesus begins the Sermon on the Mount, it sounds an awful lot like sort of a new Ten Commandments. Let's read that together, beginning in verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And so you can see, depending on how you count them, it almost adds up to around 10 for Jesus' kingdom. And notice that they're focused on not only our vertical relationship with God, but also our horizontal relationship with each other. And so after the Beatitudes, or as we're sort of depicting it, this new Ten Commandments, it doesn't surprise us then that Jesus begins thinking about how people had interacted with the Ten Commandments specifically throughout Israel's history. And so very clearly, Jesus is saying that those sort of ancient interpretations of the Ten Commandments, they're not wrong, but they're inadequate. And so Jesus would say in verse 21 of Matthew chapter 5, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times. And so he thinks back about those ancient interpretations. And he quotes Exodus 20, verse 13, our sixth commandment here, you shall not murder. But then he also includes the interpretation, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. And so apparently, the sort of traditional year after year was, if you commit murder, you're liable to judgment. But if you don't commit the act of murder, the commandment isn't necessarily all that concerned about sort of the underlying attitudes or the underlying actions or problems that might lead to such. Here, Jesus is concerned about those things. And so notice what he says after quoting the commandment. Jesus says, "But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment." And so just like the sort of ancient interpreters had said, if you commit murder, you'll be liable to judgment, Jesus says, if you're angry with your brother or sister, you're going to be liable to judgment. Now, let's think about that for just a second. Now, obviously, Jesus was from time to time angry. And Jesus, in fact, could get very angry when it came to injustices that were being committed against other people. But we see a difference between how Jesus viewed injustices committed against others. He got very angry about that from time to time, and how he thought about those sort of personal slights and insults that he would face. In fact, he would say at one point that if someone strikes you on the cheek, you're to turn the other cheek to them. The idea here is not if you are being threatened with real bodily harm, you're to allow that to continue. The idea is that if somebody insults you by slapping you, you're not to respond in kind. And so here Jesus says that if you're angry with a brother or sister, you're liable to judgment. The idea isn't that somehow that this precludes all anger. The idea is that when people personally insult you, that when people personally slight you, you're not to be filled with rage or filled with anger, because those are the very sort of emotional responses that can lead to violence in the first place. Now he continues. He says, and if you say, or insult, a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to hell of fire. And so the idea here is that you're sort of the emotions that run high in our disagreements with others, our responses to their insults are to be considered here. And the idea is that what we have a tendency to do, I think, is we have a tendency to dehumanize our rivals. And so if somebody at work or at school or a family member slights us, what we have a tendency to do is we have a tendency to dehumanize them. And so we begin calling them names. The example Jesus gives here is fool. And once that dehumanization process takes place, then the notion of violence is something that we could fall prey to and that we need to be careful about. And so as we think about the sixth commandment, not only do we need to recognize the sort of immediate context found in Exodus 20, but we need to sort of step back and see not only that micro context, but also a macro context, the big picture, where Jesus is saying, no, it's not only about the actual act, but it's also about those sort of emotional responses that sort of lead to those acts. In fact, in planning for this lesson, I did a little research, and I was looking at some FBI statistics, and it's interesting that the majority of people murdered in the United States are murdered by people that they knew, people that they already had an established relationship with. Sometimes when we watch the news or we read the latest headlines, we get concerned with sort of these random acts of violence, and we might get real fearful about venturing out because we're scared that we may be subjected to violence by a stranger. But most people, when they are subjected to violence, it's from somebody that they know. And so these sort of emotional responses are key. That we need to avoid of angry responses to these personal slights and these insults that might lead to violence. And we certainly need to avoid the notion that is so easy to fall into, the notion of dehumanizing others. That if this person is my rival, or I consider this person my enemy in some way, I dehumanize them, and therefore any sort of response, even a violent response, is acceptable because they're no longer human. They're no longer somehow worthy of the kind of respect that God expects us to share with each other. And so I think that's important as we think about sort of the broader context of this sixth commandment, you shall not murder. Now, as we sort of wrap up this lesson, many interpreters and Bible students throughout the years have noticed that in Exodus 20, the commandments are very clearly some positive and some negative in how they're written. So, for instance, if we turn back to the original text, our sixth commandment is written negatively. You shall not murder. Don't do this. And so there are some things, as we think about our relationship with God, there are some things when we think about our relationship with others that we're just simply not to do. Now, it's important that our whole spiritual lives don't get defined by what we don't do. You know, sometimes it's easy to sort of think that way. Well, I'm a good Christian, a disciple of Jesus because look at all the things I don't do. Those things are important, but there's the positive side of those things as well. And so interpreters and students and readers have noticed that some are stated positively, things that you shall do. So, for instance, you shall remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. You shall honor your father and your mother. And so while most of them are negative in orientation, some of them are positive. And so some have said, well, one of the ways that we can really figure out what these commandments are all about is to take those negative statements, for instance, you shall not murder, and restate it positively. And so I think it might be good to do that as we sort of wrap up this study. So think about how you might restate or describe the sixth commandment, you shall not murder, in a positive way. One of the ways you might do that is simply by saying that not only are we not to do harm, but we are to do active good for each other. And so you shall do active good for your brothers and sisters, those that you come in contact with every day. So it's not good enough, although it's a baseline, it's not good enough simply to avoid harming somebody. We need to do active good in the lives of other people. And so as we think about that and we sort of bring this lesson to a close, most of us probably are never going to be tempted to actually literally murder somebody. But often we are tempted, and often we succumb to the temptation to dehumanize those that we might have interpersonal problems with, so that, yes, we might avoid doing actual harm, but we also avoid doing actual good. And so it's important to recognize that not only are we to avoid doing bad things in how we relate to each other, but we're also to make sure that we take the opportunity to do good things to others, even those that might be considered our enemies. And so Jesus would say, do good to your enemies, love your enemies, do good to those who persecute you. And so Jesus focuses on not just the negatives, the things we're to avoid, but also the positive things that we are to do in the lives of others. And that is a much more challenging interpretation of this commandment, but I think a worthy one, and I think one that would certainly bless our lives and the lives of those who we interact with every day, whether it's our family relationships with our friends, people in the community, even our rivals. And so as we think about the statement, "You shall not murder," it seems very simple, but I think just like the other commandments, it's much more complex to put into practice in a way that makes sense, considering sort of the whole context of what God expects of us and the context of the gospel itself. Thank you very much.
Longs after you. My soul thirsts for the living God. Yes, my soul longs after